When we first talked about fill and stroke, we skipped over gradients. Gradients are extremely powerful. Not only are they a way to add a little interest to your color, but they are also a great way to add highlights and shadows to what would normally be very flat vector graphics. So if I select these flames down here, you can see gradient is just my middle option. If I zoom in, you can see there's my gradient box. So if I click that, I can apply a gradient to either a fill or a stroke. But in this case, I've applied a gradient to the fill, and it just used the last gradient that I had selected. If I come over here and click on my circle, I'm going to give it a fill of a gradient. And let me go ahead and pull my gradient panel over so it's a little bit easier to access. And you can see I have two types of gradients. I have a linear gradient and a radial gradient. And it's pretty self-explanatory. Linear just goes from left to right or whatever direction from that you determine. And then radial will start this first color in a center and then go out in a radial fashion. Now I'll go back to linear first. And you don't always have to just use the default sort of direction with the gradient. I'll grab my gradient tool, which is right here, gradient tool. G is the shortcut. And I can click and drag in any direction I want. And where I click, it will be in my first color here. And where I stop, it will be the last color. So I can actually click and drag off the object, and you can see it'll just get a very subtle gradient because my pure blue's over here and my pure black is over here. Okay. Now this little widget that we have, they've added this a little while ago, and what's nice about it is it allows me to adjust my colors rather than adjusting, over here. Is if I select my widget, it allows me to adjust my color directly, and even just where the color is, but even adjust what color is on each stop. So everything I can do here, I can also go over here, and it's nice. So I can add another color by just clicking anywhere between two of these stops, and I can double click. Double click and change its color. So you can see, and whatever I do in my gradients panel, it'll show up in my gradient widget. I can also rotate it by sort of just rolling over the edge and then clicking and dragging. And then if I ever sort of goof up too much, I can just always click and drag to start over. Now, coming back over to my gradient panel, let's talk about these stops. These stops give you a lot of control, and they're also going to be in Photoshop, InDesign, and After Effects, so you might as well really get to learn them now. But with these stops, I can click anywhere to add another stop. This diamond up top, that's the 50% mark between these two colors. So let's say I make this one pure white and then this one pure black. This point here will be 50% gray. Let me just go ahead and let's do a black and white gradient. You can see right here, that'll be 50% gray. I can option drag to copy a color. So that's a really easy way to sort of jump back and forth. I'm just option dragging with those colors. And again, I click, drag them off to delete them. And from there, it just takes a little bit of practice to get comfortable with linear and radial gradients. If I change it to radial now, you can see I can click and drag and change exactly where that first point is. Get this nice little highlight and shadow. And again, I can do the rotation, and I can move the colors just like I did with my linear gradient. Okay. Now, if I come down here, I actually have this one for sort of a specific example. This shape, for some reason, I drew this shape of the arrow, and you'll notice it doesn't give you the gradient widget. It's just it's a weird shape that has kind of thrown off my Illustrator, and I haven't quite figured out exactly why it doesn't always show up, because it's a little bit random. But if that ever happens to you, just remember you can always click and drag, and you have all the controls just by clicking and dragging and by using your controls up here. So if that little widget that normally shows up doesn't show up in something that you draw, don't panic. Just use your gradient tool, sort of like we used to years ago in Illustrator. Okay, so in the next video, we'll talk a little bit more specifics of uses, but just take a moment and get used to gradients.